Thank you, Robert. Saving a little time there. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to visitors in particular, coming out on this pre-storm cold morning. Glad you could be here. Usually around this time of year, I speak about the amazing man that is honored by the holiday tomorrow. But today I want to focus on Coretta Scott King, who was not just a wife, not just a mother, not just a symbol. She was, as much as anything, an activist, and that is underappreciated. It's the main message of her memoir, co-written with Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds, titled Coretta, My Life, My Love, My Legacy. It's very personal memoir, so much so that at times, as the title encourages, I'm going to refer to her by her first name, especially when she was young. It's not a sign of disrespect, but it really is a book that made me feel like I got to know her, and she uses her first name all the time. And for balance, on occasion, I will speak about Dr. King by referring to him as Martin. Now, I do rely very heavily on this memoir, so to a degree, this talk is not objective. But the memoir is amazingly transparent about the various quirks and shortcomings of Coretta Scott King. She admits to being a micromanager that drove some people crazy. She acknowledges the managerial difficulties she had in running the King Center after the assassination, but compared to her accomplishments, those are very minor things. What I will focus on are her education, her religious faith, and aspects of her relationship with Martin Luther King. I will then explore her activism, in particular three areas: her civil rights work, her economic rights work, and her peace activism. And then I want to explore the legacy that she preserved in her work after the assassination, and I'll conclude with one of the qualities of her personality and character that so impressed me, and that was her toughness. Mr. and Mrs. Scott, Coretta's parents, promoted education as the way to get ahead in this country. They believed that schooling would lead to jobs and self-sufficiency and independence that she could teach to her children, as we have an example today. Coretta and her siblings spent a lot of hours working on the family farm. Nevertheless, they were expected to walk 3 miles to and from school every day. In Marion, Georgia, segregated schools for black students were notoriously underfunded. The white community, which, by the way, was proud that a Marion school teacher, centuries and a half ago, designed the first Confederate flag, so it's not unusual that this policy was there. They funded quality education primarily for white children only. After 6th grade, Coretta's parents got enough money together to send her to the Lincoln Normal School. This was an American Missionary Association school, and Coretta there, she wrote, quote, "There she discovered that there were real loving people under a skin color that so often meant trouble or heartache for our community." Also in 9th grade is when she met Bayard Rustin, who would be the main organizer for the 1963 March on Washington. He gave a speech to her class talking about how nonviolence liberated India, and that really began to set her on the path to activism. After she graduated valedictorian, Ms. Scott attended Antioch College. This fulfilled her mother's dream of sending one of her children to college. Now, Antioch pioneered in multicultural education. I think Nick Sanders went to Antioch. Yep. It was a multicultural laboratory. Some people called it a democracy laboratory. Ms. Scott learned about the philosopher Josiah Royce and his ideal of a loving, respectful society that he labeled the beloved community, a term that is very popular today in liberal religious circles. This ideal inspired her and her future husband towards activism. Coretta took heart in the words of America's premier educator, Horace Mann, who really founded public education in our country. He was the first president of Antioch, and he said, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." Religious faith was another guiding influence in Coretta's life, and now I could have focused the entire talk on her civic contribution, but I think that would not give a full picture of Coretta. Barbara Reynolds, who co-authored that memoir, confessed that, quote, "If I approached her journey only on a secular level, I would fail her." So we don't talk a lot about religion at the Ethical Society, but Miss Scott called herself a deeply religious child. She remembers staring up at the night sky, entranced by what she called the grand display of celestial artistry. She asked herself, "Why am I here? I know God made me, but why?" Her active imagination would lead to deep introspection. "I was quite good at dream walking," she wrote. Both of Coretta's grandfathers were church leaders. Her regular attendance at the Mount Tabor AME Zion Church grounded her. It was the center of her social life. It's where her relatives and her neighbors gathered every week to reinvigorate themselves to get ready for another week of work. Sometimes young people were told to sit on a mourner's bench. I don't know how many of you know about that. Maybe we should set one up for that. No, never mind. But they would sit there, and then the adults would pray that they would let Christ into their hearts. Now, one time during a revival, Coretta said that she had this swirl of intense emotions. And she wrote, "I thought I felt something. I stood up and joined the church." And from that time on, Coretta held fast to the belief that God had a plan for her. That sense of a plan is very strong. It wasn't always clear, because at first it pointed her towards a career in singing. She went from her church choir to the New England Conservatory in Boston. And that's where she met Martin Luther King, who was studying for a PhD program in what she called systemic theology. Now, Coretta's plan to remain independent and self-sufficient waned as she grew closer to Martin. She began to yearn for a family, as did Mr. King. On their first date, he said to her, "You have everything I have ever wanted in a wife." And then he listed 4 qualities: character, intelligence, personality, and beauty. Now, despite that somewhat assertive courting style, I guess I'd call that, Coretta began to fall in love. It helped that they were both drawn to fighting oppression early on. Before they met, when she was a student at Antioch, she had volunteered for the NAACP. She worked on the Race Relations and Civil Liberties Committee, and she was involved in various peace groups on campus. King biographer Claiborne Carson, who wrote about her husband, said that Mrs. Scott, quote, "was more politically active at the time they met than Martin was." Jean Theoharis, who reviewed Coretta's memoir in The Guardian, noted that while courting, Coretta sent Martin a socialist utopian novel, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, and she included a note in the book saying, "I shall be interested to know your reaction to Bellamy's predictions about our future." So she was very individually engaged in their mutual education. Well, in their future, they decided to get married. Coretta insisted on taking the phrase, "promising to obey your husband," out of the wedding vows. Very progressive for the time. However, she did end up doing most of the household duties. She picked up after Martin, she cared for her children, she prepared the meals, and at times, MLK's patriarchy did rise up quite a bit. There were times where he reacted angrily when she didn't do as he said. Now, these were not extreme flashes. They weren't constant. They were occasional. But nevertheless, I don't think a woman as independent as Coretta today would have put up with it, frankly. She confronted more insulting sexism in the civil rights movement. Women were given a lot of administrative work at the NAACP, but rarely granted leadership opportunities. I do want to add this, though. Many of the women in the civil rights movement saw their supporting role as more than symbolic, and this perspective is actually tied to a time back in Reconstruction, right after the war, when the only black people allowed to vote in the country were black men. Now, a historian, Elsa Barclay Brown, wrote about how women understood that practically their power and rights came through their husbands. So they asserted a very strong influence over how their husband would vote. They considered the man's vote a family vote. So there's a great deal of context around how women in that community looked to what their leadership was about. And she did a lot supporting Martin. She edited his various speeches and so forth. She saw his successes as their successes, as her successes. And that's important to keep in mind. It was not such a sense of, oh, well, she just accepted a background role. Andrew Young, who became ambassador to the UN, was a deep friend of the Kings early on, admitted that, quote, much of the commitment Martin and I possessed came through our wives. Now, when Mrs. King asserted her independence separate from working with Martin, she was often called pushy and unwomanly. Later, when she became friends with the political powerhouses Indira Gandhi and Corazon Aquino, she said, I came to understand some of the strengths and perils of women at the top, particularly the way women can be condemned for doing exactly the same things which made their predecessors praised. Now, early in her courtship with Martin, he resisted her independent decision-making. There was one time where she wanted him to come down and meet his family in Atlanta over a holiday, and she declined. And he snapped, if you don't want to come, just forget it. Forget the whole thing. Now again, many other women might have walked away at that point, but she wrote, quote, a good sign. He really wants me to meet his parents. He really cares. She let a lot of things roll off her shoulders, but it didn't seem that she was being pushed around. When he asked her to stay at home for that time, there were other incidences where she would sort of get barbed by him. For example, at one point when he was trying to tell her it's good for you to stay at home, he said, quote, you see, I am called and you are not. But she did feel called by God. Most of the time, though, Martin did encourage her to speak her mind and to be independent. I want to stress that. As long as she didn't stop being a mother and a homemaker. But she found those roles nourishing to her. Besides, she felt so deeply bonded with him in partnership that she called it preordained. She emphasized this deep connection with them at the very start of her memoir. She wrote, our lives were too inseparable to be perforated. You know, the little dots between paper. She said, cutting us one from the other would leave a jagged edge. They were really bonded. She even liked being referred to as the other half. All right? She called the two of them emotional twins that were always only one heartbeat away. She said we were one heartbeat, one soul. When I was in jail, when he was in jail, I was in jail. When he was beaten up, I was beaten up. Now, at the same time, she was her own person. Though the public often only saw her as Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., her memoir begins, there is a Mrs. King, there is also a Coretta. How one became detached from the other remains a mystery to me. She didn't like being talked about, she said, quote, like attachments that come with my vacuum cleaner. So at times, Dr. King asserted his own autonomy, and it stung. Once he told her, quote, you know, a man who dedicates himself to a cause doesn't need a family. Ouch. It kind of reminds me how Gandhi hurt some of the people closest to him by asserting that his higher cause was more important than they were. She said that it didn't hurt her, though, because, quote, I knew he was searching for a balance between asceticism and materialism. Maybe a justification, but it did seem at times that she was resigned to being of secondary importance. She said, as much as I loved Martin, I knew he belonged not just to me, but to his calling. It had to be his first priority. And it's not for me to question that commitment on her part. She poured herself into the role of being a mother, particularly regarding ethical education of her children. She relayed moral lessons through example more than through preaching. She said, "I strove to be a role model with consistent character and values." She tried to embody ethical integrity, something that the founder of ethical culture talks a lot about, how you have to be that integrity. She wrote, "There should be no difference between public morality and private morality. When I preached publicly, I tried to live out privately in front of my children." Now, she had to help her children understand the crazy world that they were in. I mean, I can't imagine the mental gymnastics she had to do to explain to her 3-year-old why there was a cross burning on their lawn. When Martin was attacked or incarcerated, she had to reassure her kids. They came home from school crying, saying they were being teased because their daddy was a jailbird. The youngest child, Dexter, was really struggling the first time he saw his father behind bars. In some ways, Mrs. King extended her identity as a mother to the nation and the world. She explained, "I felt deeply that women were the conscience of the family and we could be the conscience of the nation too." It's similar to how Jane Addams used traditional views of women to extend her power into civic places. She framed ending child labor, improving housing, feeding the poor as a simple expansion of the woman's traditional role. It's the only way she could have gotten that powerful. And similarly, I think that's part of Coretta's message. When she founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center back in 1968, she called it "My Fifth Child," which I think allowed her to control it more. People respected that framing of women's power at the time. But she was so much more than a wife and a mother. She was an activist as much as anything. Her daughter, Dr. Bernice King, said, "Before she was a king, my mother was a civil rights activist." And during the 38 years after the assassination of her husband, she was an activist and as engaged as ever. So the 3 areas of her work: economic, civil, and peace activism. These were all integrally tied together in some ways with her experiences when she was young around racial trauma, because all of those things came to pass: the violence, or the civil rights violations, and the poverty that was forced on them. She heard stories about her great uncle who was lynched and hung in a tree. She remembers white students jeering at her and other black students as they walked to school out of a school bus that the white students rode in while the school bus splashed mud on them. The worst probably, though, was 1942, Thanksgiving night, when the home that her father built was burned to the ground by Klan members. Why? Because he refused to sell it to them. Her father at that moment told her, "We don't have time to cry." They persevered. When Coretta attended Antioch, she experienced more subtle forms of racism. Despite the school having a very progressive persona in some ways, students were racially naive. They often revealed their stereotypes about black people to her. They said they were surprised that she was so much of an individual with a mind of her own, right? "You're so different from the rest of them," they told her. The school administrations didn't help her fulfill a requirement of her education program, which was to teach in a local school. But because the schools are segregated, they didn't allow black women to teach there. The president did not step in to help her, and that even though it was a progressive institution, maybe it wasn't that surprising because he named his dog the N-word. But Coretta became comfortable in college standing up for herself. She wrote, "I found I rather liked making waves and being a catalyst for change." When she met the singer and activist Paul Robeson, his example helped her link her singing and her activism. Moving forward, she followed his pattern of, at her concerts, She would give political statements. After she married Dr. King, Mrs. King stood tall through the challenges of Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma. On January 30th, 1956, 2 months after the start of the bus boycott, a bomb went off on their front porch of their house in Montgomery. And after Mrs. King ran to make sure that her firstborn was safe, the phone rang and she picked it up and she heard a growly voice saying, "I'm sorry I didn't kill all you bastards." She was able to hold it together. She spoke to the press. She resisted her father's demand that she return to Atlanta, to their home neighborhood. And Martin called her a brave soldier. She didn't flinch when she moved to Birmingham. Now, that was the city that responded to the Supreme Court's ruling against segregation by closing 68 parks, 38 playgrounds, 6 pools, and 4 golf courses, rather than integrating. This was the city where in 1956, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was an icon of that black community, had his home bombed. And the next year, because he tried to enroll his children in public school, he was chain whipped in public in front of the police. This was the city where the 6 years before the Kings arrived, it was nicknamed Bombingham because 18 unsolved bombings had destroyed the homes and churches of black people. And after those 4 young girls died in the blast at the 6th Street Baptist Church in September of '63, Coretta sang at their memorial. She continued on to Selma, a place that she called rock bottom, where words such as democracy, representative government, and citizenship had no meaning. She marched to Montgomery to demand the vote, and there was some success, but the price was so high. She wrote, after 2 murders and nearly 3,800 arrests, only about 50 African Americans were registered to vote. That's a hard road. When the movement turned from civil rights to economic rights, the violent backlash got worse. As part of her economic work, the Kings moved to Chicago, where she said the poverty was worse than what she saw in the South. The only time the entire King family marched was in a march for Chicago Freedom Movement for housing, employment, and health equity. Martin Luther King sadly said, "I had never seen, even in Mississippi, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as in Chicago." There was some success there when Operation Breadbasket built economic power in the black community of Chicago. And in addition, the Poor People's Campaign began to build this rainbow coalition for broader political power. Mrs. King pointed out the double-edged nature of that success. Quote, "Now that the movement was showing enough muscle to unify protesters across a broad spectrum of ethnic and economic groups, we had become the enemy." Then Martin went to Memphis. He was there to defend the economic rights of the sanitation workers, and on April 4th of '68, he was shot in the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. I cannot imagine the courage it took for Mrs. King to speak from that same balcony 4 days later. She'd always been committed to the rights of workers, though, and I think that's so important. She wasn't there just filling in for her husband. She had always been there, and she took her father's belief that she didn't have time to cry. At Central Park, only a month after the assassination, she emphasized the link between economic justice and the war in Vietnam. The link that Martin Luther King made at Riverside Church, which many say is the reason why he was assassinated. She declared at that rally, "My husband always saw problems of racism and poverty here at home and militarism abroad as 2 sides of the same coin." There's a lot of evidence that she, in fact, was the one who taught him that lesson. Dr. King had wavered about talking about Vietnam for a couple of years because after some initial statements, he got such hard backlash. But after he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, it was his wife that pressed him to apply nonviolence, to resist militarism, and to defend human rights more forcefully. In that Central Park rally, she taught how violence comes in all forms. She said, "I must remind you that a starving child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother in a family is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence." And in that way, Mrs. King explained, quote, "The bombs we drop on Vietnam continue to explode here at home with devastating results." She had long understood the international perspective. In 1962, she was in Geneva with the United Nations Disarmament Conference. In 1965, she was the only woman speaker at a Madison Square Garden anti-war rally. 65, that's well before it was popular. And finally, 2 years later, her husband spoke forcefully against the war at Riverside Church. And when asked by the press if he educated Coretta about Vietnam, he responded, "She educated me." In 1976, when 360 children were massacred in Soweto, Mrs. King joined the struggle against apartheid. She traveled a lot of times to South Africa, but she ran into resistance from other leaders. Jesse Jackson and Randall Robinson, who was the founder of Trans Africa, had their own approaches to this struggle, and they criticized her for stirring things up and disrupting their work. But she navigated that infighting and remained with the cause, drawing attention to it. And then in 1990, she awarded to Nelson Mandela, who had just been released, the King Center's International Freedom Award. The State Department then contracted with the King Center under her leadership to train South African activists in nonviolence. She often spoke in support of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Jimmy Carter, who was actually very close to the Kings early on, all three of them were born in the 1920s in Georgia, appointed Mrs. King as special delegate to the UN, the first Black American woman to serve in that role. And then, thanks to her uncompromising dedication to human rights, the Reagan administration banned her from Radio Free Europe and any official government trips. So she got tripped up in politics quite a bit. She really wanted to defeat Nixon and Reagan, who she thought were grave threats to the Black community. So she supported McGovern and Mondale. For this pragmatism, she was called an Uncle Tom and a traitor to her race because she didn't endorse the two Black candidates, Shirley Chisholm in 72 and Jesse Jackson in 84. Then she tried to reach out to Republicans. She attended the 1988 Republican Convention. She said she was trying to put nation above party, and she was trying to expand her connections. But the Bush team managed to get her seated next to Barbara Bush, and that was a photo op that went all across the world. And she was really criticized for that. She insisted that her dream was nonpartisan, but she stopped going to conventions and no longer endorsed anybody after that time. She really, at that point, turned herself fully to the legacy of her husband. She tried to keep his dream alive. She started curating Martin's speeches way back in the 60s during the 50s in the Montgomery bus boycott. She began that by doing archives in her basement in Montgomery. She hoped that this would grow into a mecca for nonviolent activists, she said. In 1981, she secured $3.5 million from the federal government and got other private contributions, and construction began on Auburn Avenue, just a block or two down from King's childhood home. She managed to get that modest dwelling recognized as a historic birthplace by the National Register. First time a Black American's birth home was not acknowledged as such. But probably the most impressive legacy was her getting Martin Luther King holiday, officially a federal holiday. It faced more resistance than I realized. It was proposed to Congress 70 times before it was passed. She got support of Congressman John Conyers, a remarkable individual who died recently, and the Congressional Black Caucus, and they triumphed. And on January 20th of 1986, Martin Luther King Day was first celebrated as a federal holiday. I want to end today by focusing on that strength of character that I saw in Mrs. King that really struck me. Her toughness, her persistence, her strength. She worked on her family farm when she was 6 years old. She hired herself out to chop cotton when she was 10. I think a lot of the toughness came from her father, that's what she said, who told her that they didn't have time to cry. And she was fearless, and she strove to imitate him. Dr. King, I think, reinforced that stoicism, fearing when his death was imminent. He sort of had these inclinations that it was coming. He told her, "I don't want you to spend time grieving." Now, surely she grieved, but she mainly grieved in private. She would talk about being in her bedroom, grieving, and then she'd pull herself together and walk out into her home to her children looking strong and confident. She said, "I could heal as I pressed on. I could not wait until I felt better to heal. I just had to run on and let the healing catch up to me." Our history focuses so much on the men who had become martyrs to the cause: Dr. King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and their sacrifice is profound and important. But so too was the sacrifice of their widows, who had become dear friends. Mrs. King, Myrlie Everett Williams, Betty Shabazz. They carried their grief with an incredible positivity. There's a picture in the memoir of the three of them together smiling in 1995, and it brought joy to my heart. In 1960, Maya Angelou became the fundraising coordinator for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I didn't know that. She became a very good friend of the Kings. Martin actually told Coretta to hang out with Maya more because she made Coretta laugh, which he didn't think she did enough. Maya knew her very well, and when Mrs. King died in 2006, Maya Angelou offered these reflections in a eulogy. In the midst of national tumult, in the medium of international violent uproar, Coretta Scott King's face remained a study in serenity. In times of interior violent storms, she sat, her hands resting on her lap calmly, like good children sleeping. Her passion was never spent in a public display. She offered her industry and her energies to action toward righting ancient and current wrongs in this world. She believed religiously in nonviolent protest. She believed it could heal a nation mired in a history of slavery and all its excesses. She believed in nonviolent protest religiously that could lift up a nation rife with racial prejudice and racial bias. She was a quintessential African-American woman, born in the small-town repressive South, born of flesh and destined to become iron, born a cornflower and destined to become a steel magnolia. Now, I don't know if Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise, was written for Mrs. King, but it sure reflects how she responded to tragedy. Coretta wrote that she learned to, quote, push our shoulders back, keep our heads high, and walk with dignity, looking as if we had oil wells in our backyard. I've always loved that phrase. And I suddenly saw it in Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise. I'll end with this. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like the moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, because I laugh like I got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear the tide. Leaving behind the nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Thanks for listening.